Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. Who is responsible for climate change? Is it the countries with the highest pollution right now? Or is it wealthy countries who had the highest emissions in the past? How about fossil fuel companies? Or is it normal people? Let's talk about climate change and learn some new vocabulary today on the Thinking in English podcast. You can find a full and free transcript over on the Thinking in English blog. Head over to my Instagram page and YouTube, Thinking in English podcast, to follow for more content, and leave a like, rating and review wherever you are listening right now. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Mitigation. Mitigation. The act of reducing how harmful, unpleasant or bad something is. As in, we need effective mitigation of climate change. Adaptation. Adaptation. The process of changing to suit different conditions. For example, the team's adaptation to the speed of the Premier League is surprising. Developing. Developing. A developing country or area of the world is poorer and has less advanced industries, especially in Africa, Latin America or Asia. For example, this scholarship is for people from developing countries. Reparation. Reparation. Payment for harm or damage. For example, the company had to make reparations to those who suffered ill health as a result of chemical pollution. Emission. Emission. An amount of a substance that is produced and sent out into the air that is harmful to the environment, especially carbon dioxide. For example, these health risks are caused by vehicle emissions. Per capita. Per capita. If you express an amount per capita, you mean that amount for each person. As in, the per capita income is very low. Carbon footprint. Carbon footprint. Someone's carbon footprint is a measurement of the amount of carbon dioxide that their activities produce. For instance, flying to Japan increased my carbon footprint. To offset. To offset. To pay for things that will reduce carbon dioxide in order to reduce the damage caused by carbon dioxide that you produce. For example, we offset all our long-haul flights. The world's leaders have gathered in Egypt for COP27, a global meeting aimed at dealing with the problems of climate change. World leaders, politicians, and negotiators from most of the world's countries are making agreements and deciding on future policies. It has been 30 years since the United National Framework Convention of Climate Change was agreed, and 7 years since COP21 and the Paris Agreement. Since the first COP meetings, the impact of climate change has become even more obvious. Increased natural disasters, extreme weather, and heat waves, just some of the signs. COP27 will discuss a variety of different issues, from climate change mitigation and adaptation techniques to the financial side of international efforts. Mitigation refers to lessening or avoiding climate change, and adaptation refers to adapting our societies and economies to survive climate change better. One of the more difficult issues to agree on is what is called loss and damage. Climate change is destructive, and some of its consequences cannot be avoided through mitigation or adaptation. There will be damage because of climate change. In fact, there already is damage. Extreme weather events, heat waves which have damaged crops and caused wildfires, rising sea levels, and much more. Who should pay for this loss and damage? Basically, who should pay for the cost of climate change? Who is responsible for climate change? The sad reality is that the countries that contribute the least to climate change are often left to deal with the consequences. Tiny islands in the Pacific and Indian Oceans have to deal with rising sea levels. Countries in Africa and South Asia have to deal with searing temperatures. Developing countries have repeatedly asked developed countries for financial help to deal with climate change. Developed countries have contributed the most to climate change, either historically or currently, and poorer countries want and need help from the rich and powerful. But here lies a problem. Signing up to the idea of loss and damage would be admitting you are responsible for climate change, and most countries don't want to do this. So far, Scotland and Wallonia, a region of Belgium, became the first regions from rich countries to pledge money to address loss and damage, with £2 million and €1 million pledges. Denmark followed with a 100 million Danish kroner pledge, roughly around $13 million. However, it's going to take a lot more money to deal with the impact of climate change. So, who is responsible for climate change, and who should pay for its consequences? Wealthy countries such as the US, Australia, the UK, and Japan signed commitments to give $100 billion to climate mitigation and adaptation by 2020. They missed these targets, and they'll need to sign another agreement to give more money before 2025. However, most scientists agree that trillions of dollars, not hundreds of millions, will be required to help poorer countries to adapt to and mitigate the consequences of climate change. However, while the money is not enough, wealthy countries have been giving some money. For example, Pakistan was able to build a new public transport system, helping to reduce the amount of fossil fuels used in the country. And they've also given money to Guinea-Bissau, who received help in restoring mangrove forests, which form a natural protection against rising sea levels. But while countries have been willing to give some money to pay for mitigation and adaptation, they have been very reluctant to pay for loss and damage costs. Supporters of the idea of loss and damage claim that it is a kind of climate reparations, to pay for the damage caused by climate change. Loss of lives, loss of buildings and infrastructure, loss of animals and plants, and loss of income. Climate change can cause all of these things. Wealthy countries have been against such payments for years. Why? Well, wealthy countries don't want to admit they are responsible, at least in part, for climate change. There is a fear that by paying compensation for the damage caused by climate change, developed nations will be held legally responsible, something they definitely don't want. So, who is responsible for climate change? Does every country hold an equal responsibility? Should it be based on the amount of pollution a country makes in total, or per person? How about companies or individual people? Are they responsible too? Well, let's discuss that right now. Who is responsible for climate change? I guess The most obvious place to start is with the countries that pollute the most, the countries with the highest amount of pollution, or in other words, the highest greenhouse gas emissions. Over the past decades, it has been shown that greenhouse gas emissions are responsible for accelerating, increasing, and worsening the effects of our changing climate. So, it makes sense that the countries emitting the most gases are the ones who should be most responsible for climate change. Right? Well, if we take a look at the top polluting countries today, there is a clear winner: China. China has by far the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions over the past few years. In fact, China emits twice as much as the USA, which is the country in second place. The other countries in the top 5 worst polluters include India, Russia, and Japan. If we just count the big 3 polluting countries, China, the USA, and India, they produce almost half of the total global pollution today. Looking at the statistics, it would be easy to say China, the US, and India are the biggest polluters in the world, so they must be responsible for climate change, and they should pay the most. But it's not that simple. There are other ways to look at emissions. For example, a country's emissions per person, or per capita. Of course, India and China are big polluters. They have incredibly large populations, though. If we take into account their population, which country is the biggest polluter? Well, the largest polluters per capita are generally oil-rich states in the Middle East. Qatar is at the top of that list, with an annual CO2 emission of around 35 tons per person. Bahrain, Kuwait, Brunei, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman all have very high emissions if we adjust to measure per person. How about the big 3 emitting countries, China, India, and the US? Well, the US is still a high emission country, with an average of nearly 15 tons of CO2 per person in 2021. China, however, currently emits around 8 tons per person a year, almost half the amount of the US. High-income countries on average contribute around 10 tons of CO2 per capita a year, so China is below the average of other high-income countries. And India is significantly lower, just 1.93 tons per person. That is 7 times less than the US and 5 times less than the average for wealthy countries. So while India and China do produce a lot of pollution, per person, per capita, their emissions are lower than many of the countries that criticize them. And there is another way to look at these statistics as well. Historically, the highest polluting countries in 2022 are not necessarily the countries that have caused the most damage historically or overall. If we look at CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, the picture is a little different. The USA has produced around 25% of all global CO2 emissions in history. EU countries around 22%, and Europe in general around 33%. China has produced about half the amount of the USA, just over 12% of global emissions, and India is down at 4%. How about rich countries? Should we hold rich countries responsible for climate change? Europe and the US have polluted the environment for hundreds of years. Developing countries like China, India, and others in Asia or Latin America only started the process of industrialization and increasing the use of fossil fuels much later. And this has been an incredibly difficult question to solve internationally. Countries like China and India are still developing their economies, and they're growing. they have lower emissions per capita than many high-income nations. But this doesn't change the fact that they are still major polluters today. In 1992, the first major international climate treaty was signed and included a controversial principle. Countries have different historic responsibilities for emissions. Basically, countries were not all equally responsible for climate change. Wealthy countries have produced the majority of emissions throughout history and still produce high levels today. They have had a much more influential role in destroying our environment and climate. And they used their pollution to their advantage. One of the reasons Europe and North America was able to develop so quickly was the use of coal-powered industry for over 100 years. Coal is particularly harmful to the environment, but for countries like China and India, it is a vital resource to power their economies today. Is it fair on India or China to limit their chances at growing economies or creating wealthier societies, especially when rich countries spent years, decades, doing the same thing? While the principle that wealthier countries are more responsible for climate change was agreed 30 years ago, it has not been easy to make any real agreements or policies. Wealthy countries probably should be helping developing countries at the same time as cutting their own emissions. What about fossil fuel companies? Simply blaming countries for pollution and climate change is not enough, in my opinion. Fossil fuel companies also share a significant amount of blame for our current and future problems. Let me demonstrate the role of fossil fuel companies in climate change using a few famous studies. A report in 2017 found that 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions in the previous 20 years came from just 100 fossil fuel producing companies. 100 companies, 70% of global emissions. That's a lot. And last year, another report showed how just 20 companies contributed 33% of all global emissions. These are companies like BP, Shell, and Chevron, and they produce more pollution than most countries in the world do. And perhaps even worse, these companies have been influential in denying climate change and increasing support for fossil fuels. Fossil fuel companies have funded research and politicians that protect their interests. They downplay the impact of their businesses on environment, and they try to change the public attitude. For example, one of the big claims made by companies is that cutting down on fossil fuels will unfairly impact poor people, although this is not necessarily true. So I'm going to tell you something that you might not realize. Have you heard of the concept of a personal carbon footprint? I'm sure you have. It's basically how much pollution you make yourself. By driving your car, flying on a plane on vacation, buying plastic bottles, or leaving lights on in your house. This idea of a personal carbon footprint has been incredibly influential. There are campaigns around the world to get people to produce less pollution. I'm sure you've seen campaigns like this. Turn off your office lights before you leave the room. Take shorter showers. Buy an electric car. Offset your CO2 when flying. But do you know who started this campaign? Which company, which group popularized the idea of having a personal carbon footprint? Well, one of the big companies who did one of the major advertising campaigns about personal carbon footprints was BP, British Petroleum, the oil company. Their media campaign in 2005 basically started this idea of personal responsibility for climate change, when really BP reducing their emissions by 1% would probably be the best thing for the environment. I don't believe we should be focusing on personal responsibility for climate change, but it is undeniable some people do personally cause more pollution than others. In fact, research from the University of Leeds suggests that the richest 10% of people in the world use 20 times more energy than the poorest 10%. If you're like me and you have flown on a plane in the last year, or even more if you've flown long haul, if you've flown to a different continent on a plane in the last year, you're probably one of the worst carbon emitters in the world as an individual, right? Flying on a plane is the worst thing you can do for the environment. I remember talking to a friend once who was criticizing me for buying a plastic water bottle. She said I should always have a reusable water bottle, so I don't produce plastic waste and I don't contribute to climate change. And that's fair enough. I now use a reusable water bottle. However, I know this same person took 6 flights in 1 year. 4 of those flights long haul from Europe to Asia. I think I would have needed to buy billions of bottles of water to create as much pollution as she did by flying. But I don't like this idea of personal responsibility for climate change. It's my own opinion, of course. But I think companies have done an incredible job in convincing us normal people, that we should be the one reducing our energy usage and reducing the amount of plastic we buy. But if the companies took action themselves, it would be much more effective. So here is today's final thought. Who is responsible for climate change? Is it the highest polluting countries? Is it wealthy countries? Is it fossil fuel companies? Or all of us together? Perhaps it is better to not think about responsibility. As I've tried to show, no one wants to be responsible for climate change. Wealthy countries blame the increasing emissions from developing world. Developing countries blame the historic emissions of rich countries. And fossil fuel companies blame normal people for using their own products. Instead of thinking about blame and responsibility, I think we need to think about the long-term future of our societies. We need to work together to protect everyone's environment. But who do you think is responsible for climate change? Who should pay for its consequences and costs? Let me know in the comments on the Thinking in English blog, the comments on Spotify, or send me a message on Instagram. My Instagram is Thinking in English Podcast, and I'm very close to 10,000 followers. It would be awesome to get to 10,000 by December, I guess. Maybe sometime in December. I would love to have 10,000 followers. And I also have a YouTube channel now, Thinking in English Podcast over there. Hopefully we can get another episode out on YouTube either today or tomorrow. So around this week sometime. So if you go and subscribe over there, and you can have watch and listen to another episode of Thinking in English. And I also have a Patreon, patreon.com/Thinking in English. It's a platform for fans of a podcast to support me and help me grow. And you can join our conversation club. You can get bonus episodes, lots of great stuff over there. We're nearly at 100 subscribers, which is incredible. It's given me so much confidence and hope that we can turn this into a business eventually. One that can, support me and mean I can make more podcasts, launch more podcasts, make better episodes for you guys, because I won't need to be working 3 or 4 jobs at the same time. I can just concentrate on the podcast. So please go over to Patreon and support me. And the Conversation Club is great. Everyone who joins it really enjoys the Conversation Club. So I'm sure you guys would all enjoy it as well. But thank you for listening today. Subscribe to my Patreon, support me on Instagram, leave a like and rating, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.